How do modern motherboards differ from each other? On the surface, a motherboard appears to me like it's not a performance part like a CPU or a graphics card. The purpose, at least from my understanding, is to connect the various hardware parts together, as well as offer a handful of USB and other interface ports on the back. As such, when buying a motherboard, any motherboard that supported my CPU socket seemed to be as good as any other. What exactly is the difference between them? What should I look out for when determining whether a motherboard will fit my needs?
This question actually comes down to what a modern motherboard actually does. I agree that in many, if not most of the cases, the answer is provide the glue between well-spec'd components along the lines of a reference implementation. So let's look for differentiating aspects. Mechanical, since the main board decides the position of the extension slots, it bears final responsibility, how many and which extension cards, for example PUS, can be used. On-board devices, there is no universal answer, it depends on the use case whether you need or want additional SATA or SAS ports, a fancy sound device, more Ethernet ports, etc. Build quality, for me this is the most important aspect. If you drive your hardware to its analog limits, i.e. temperature, frequency, etc., you want to have the most reliable components assembled in the most reliable way. Especially capacitors come in a wide variety of qualities and they do make a price difference. The engineering hours to know where to put them also don't come easy. Software, a board is useless without its firmware, UEFI, BIOS, setup utility, etc. Depending on its implementation, it will not only allow you more or less headroom, for example when overclocking, it will also have important influence if you want to use something else than Windows. And just as other software, the firmware might need an update here or there when new parts become available or a combination of factors is found that triggers a not yet known error. Basically, it's a matter of trust. Are you comfortable with giving this or that vendor the responsibility to keep your rig fast and reliable? This is why different brands and different product lines within those brands exist.
Here's a list of a few of the main differences when it comes to consumer motherboards. Chipset. Each line of CPUs has a list of chipsets which it is compatible with. Some of these chipsets provide the ability to overclock the CPU while others don't. Some chipsets provide more features and integrated peripherals than others, such as more 10GB/S USB ports, more SATA ports, integrated RAID boot support and virtualization support. Here is an example comparison table for some of the chipsets AMD offers for their latest CPUs, as of 2011, showing how some have more features enabled than others. The chipset is an integral and irreplaceable part of whichever motherboard you opt for. If you don't need high bandwidth PCI lanes or overclocking support, you may find you can save money with a lower-end chipset board. Otherwise, if you're setting up a moderately high-end gaming PC, opting for a higher-end chipset that at least supports overclocking is a good idea. Form factor. Most consumer motherboards today come in 4 sizes: EAT, ATX, Micro ATX and Mini. Generally speaking, each size is just as capable of running whatever hardware hosts without any compromise in performance, but smaller motherboards may have fewer PCI slots, fewer RAM slots and fewer ports and peripherals. Smaller motherboards can be great if they support everything you need, as they allow you to use smaller cases which may be easier to transport and less of an eyesore in the room they're in. Power delivery. Close to the CPU on any motherboard is a part of the circuit called the VRM, voltage regulator module. This is implemented with a multi-phase buck converter containing a collection of inductors, MOSFETs and capacitors. The VRM is crucial to provide a stable voltage to the CPU while it draws a very high current. Generally speaking, more phases in the VRM provides better power delivery, as well as use of higher quality components. If you're not doing anything like overclocking your CPU, you may find it completely unnecessary to even consider what your motherboard provides by way of a VRM to your CPU. However, if you are interested in overclocking and running a high-end gaming PC, VRMs are a commonly discussed topic which is worth doing some research into. I am also aware of at least one cheaper motherboard, specifically for AMD Threadripper CPUs, which is limited in its support to only the lower-end CPU models, in what would otherwise be its full supported CPU series, simply because they don't provide a sufficient VRM for running the higher-end processors. C slots. If you look carefully at the specifications of your motherboard, you should find they describe what exactly each C slot supports. While you might think you could just plug any card you want into any slot that fits, and more C slots are better, in practice, standard consumer CPUs, besides head CPUs such as Intel Core X series, AMD Threadripper, only have a limited number of PSI lanes usable. Intel boards typically only have 16 lanes, which is all the lanes of a single PU, while AMD boards typically only have 20 available lanes, which is enough for one PU and one SSD. This means that if you want to connect, for example, 2 PUs at once, you need the lanes to be split into 2x8 lane slots. This would normally still give plenty of bandwidth for PUs, besides maybe some PU workloads. You should pay careful attention to exactly how the slots are configured if you are intending on doing this, as not all motherboards will bifurcate the main 16 lanes into 2 8-lane slots, and instead might only support the full 16 lanes going to the first slot, leaving the other slot with just 4 lanes physically connected to it, connected to the auxiliary C lanes provided by the chipset, contended for bandwidth. If you want 3 moderately high bandwidth C peripherals connected to your motherboard, for example 2 PUs plus 1 SAS hub for hard drives, it's much harder than it looks to find a motherboard which properly supports all these at once. Currently, there are just a few PSI 4.0 supporting AMD motherboards which allow for running 3 PSI 3.0 x 8 cards at once with minimal bandwidth contention. One cool feature provided by a few mini motherboards, which only have a single PSI X16 slot on board, is the ability to use a passive PSI riser card, which bifurcates the slot into 2 x8 lane slots, which can be used to get a very compact dual PU PC. It is however quite difficult to find out if various motherboards support this or not. The main thing to note with C slots is the physical width of the slot does not necessarily determine the number of lanes actually wired to it and usable. Most M.2 slots are also just another form factor of C slots, which also require C lanes from either the CPU or chipset routing to them. Depending on your needs, you should pay close attention to whether using an M.2 slot for a PSI drive would conflict with also using one of the main C slots on the board. Onboard peripherals. Some motherboards provide a collection of useful onboard peripherals, which aren't provided by just the CPU and chipset, such as extra 10GB/S Ethernet cards, SAS holders or RAID controllers, Wi-Fi cards and high-quality sound cards. Aesthetics. Some people have different preferences as to how they want their motherboard to look, particularly when setting up flashy gaming pieces with window cases. Some motherboards are different colors and some have lots of flashy rainbow LEDs. Some also provide headers for controlling external addressable RGB LED strips with onboard firmware. Fans and cooling. Motherboards typically have multiple integrated PWM fan control headers, which allow case fans plus CPU fans to be wired directly to the motherboard, which get controlled by an onboard microcontroller. Some boards will come with more fan headers than others, and some may not have PWM control support for all the fans. Some motherboards also provide voltage regulation for controlling fan speed, as an alternative for slowing down non-PWM fans. Different boards by different manufacturers may have better or worse options in their settings for adjusting fan curves and linking fan speeds to different temperatures, including the CPU temperature and external temperature sensor pins. High-end motherboards with lots of fan headers, as well as additional sensor pins, may be a good choice for people opting for a custom water cooling solution for their CPU and bus, where they may have a sizable array of fans which cool radiators, and they may have water temperature and flow rate sensors. Another thing to note is a few motherboards have integrated fans to cool parts such as the chipset, which some people may find to be slightly unfavorable and noisy compared to fanless motherboards.
If you want to support the channel, please don't share, subscribe,